Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. As you can see, I've got the LS1 almost completely assembled with the T56 transmission back on the cradle, getting ready to put it back into the 1LE Camaro. Before I go any further though, I'm going to backtrack a little bit and I'm going to show you guys how I got here, go through the final assembly of the motor, putting everything back together just so I've covered it and just so you haven't missed anything. But before I do that, would like to get into just a few little things. First thing is, normally I like to be pretty respectful in the comments. Most people just are asking honest questions and I try to give honest answers. Every once in a while though, you get kind of a douchebag. And one person kind of pissed me off in my last video asking, that's it? 5 minutes of SEMA coverage? Can't believe I wasted my time on your video. Well, for those of you guys who know me, you know that I'm a mechanic. I don't make a lot of money, and this is what I do in my hobby and trying to get the YouTube channel going, hopefully maybe as a future business. But I'm a mechanic. And as that said, I went to the SEMA show as part of my job. So I'm looking at the cars, but I'm also checking out all the vendors. And I wasn't there to film the show. As you guys know, when I do my channel, everything I do is pretty much done in my shop. That was just kind of a bonus. I was there, I got some shots, I just wanted to share it on the channel, and I did that. Thought, it'd be a nice thing to do. Now, if I was getting paid to do the filming, or if I had 10 million viewers on my YouTube channel, then I would be more than happy to film all of SEMA for your viewing delight. But that is not the case. I had other people from work with me, co-workers there, and they didn't want to be held up by me looking like a dumbass filming everything for my YouTube channel. So, to answer that question, that is why you only got 5 minutes of footage, because that's not why I was there. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, go to part number 2. So as you can see on this motor, if you saw it from the previous video, it looks way better than it did before. It is pretty clean, degreased, reassembled. Hopefully there will be 0 leaks. And that comes to the other part, which is a lot of this could have been handled if the previous douchebag owner would have taken care of a bunch of this stuff. He calls himself a mechanic, and yet this was a complete fucking mess. And no, Henry, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the other douchebag, okay? Anyway, so I have to go and take what I thought was a daily driver and completely rebuild it because somebody was selling something as something that it wasn't, which was a perfect car. And I don't mind getting a project car, knowing it's a project car, but I really hate fixing other people's fuck-ups, especially when they will never take responsibility for anything they do. Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. Anyway, enough of me ranting again. Let's get on to the project, shall we? So let's get into this build and show you guys how I got to here. All right, so let's get this thing put back together. Here's a short block, and since you guys have seen this last course, I do have this covered up, and you guys want to have this covered up with some sort of plastic or just a bag, anything to keep dust out of it if you're storing it for more than a couple of hours. Definitely got the harmonic balancer on. That's on since you guys have seen it last. And then I've got the flywheel on and torqued in place, as well as an oil filter on there as well. So now it's time to get these heads on. And before we can do that, we need to put the lifters in, lifter trays, and then get the head gaskets on, get the heads on, and get everything bolted and torqued down. Now, let's check out our casserole here, shall we? So I've got my lifters that have been soaking in this GM EOS oil for over 24 hours. There's a lot of debate on whether to soak your lifters or not. Really, I just want them in here so they've got a lot of good lube on them. This is one thing I use to put my motors together. I actually put this in my break-in oil when I'm breaking a motor in. They say this is assembly lubricant only. I actually put this 16-ounce bottle. It all ends up in the motor when I'm doing the initial 500 to 1,000 mile break-in. They've been soaking in that, and then I will drain this out, and eventually this will go in the motor as well. So I'm gonna pull these out, get these in the lifter trays, and get them in the motor. For the lifters that I'm using, I am using GM Performance LS7 lifters. These are not LS7 style lifters. These are actual LS7 lifters. So these are pricey. It's one thing I did not want to skimp on the motor because it's so far in the motor. I do not want these to fail, so I want the best chance this motor is going to have. So I will get the part number for you guys in a minute on these, but these are actual GM Performance LS7 lifters. They're about $400 a set. Lifter trays are just a standard LS2 style lifter tray. And the head gaskets are GM head gaskets. These are 3.910 head gaskets for LS1, LS6 motors, bored up to 10 thousandths over. Okay, so messy part now. Got the lifters installed in the lifter tray. And now I'm gonna get this in the motor. Just to show you guys here, these indentations go down, and I'm gonna use two hands to do this, and there is a part number, like I promised, for the LS7 lifters. Got all the lifters and the trays on this side of the block, and gonna torque these two bolts, well, technically 4 bolts, 2 per bank, to 106 inch-pounds. And I'll point out these notches pointed down. If you have an LS2 block, the block actually has embossments where those line up with those embossments. An LS1 block does not have those, but notches go down, 106 inch-pounds. And for those of you guys that question things like me, on these lifters, you have the oil hole in them right there. And it doesn't matter which orientation you do it. You can have that facing left or right. Oil will get to that no matter what. So don't worry about that orientation so much. Or if you're like me and you have that OCD, just point them all in the same direction. All right, so lifter trays are torqued down and the deck surface is completely clean. I hit it one more time with brake cleaner, gave it a wipe down, and got the head gasket sitting on here. And as you can see, this is perfectly sized for this particular motor. You could use it on a 5.3 as well, but these again are 3.910, so they're specifically made for LS1, LS6s. And then head's ready to go on as well. One thing I do like to do on these is with my glove, I like to just wipe a clean glove across both of these faces before I set them together. That just grabs any lint or anything that may still be stuck on them, so you get a really nice seal. These are recommended just to go on dry, and that's what I'm doing. I'm not putting any type of copper sealant or anything on these. With these MLS gaskets, with this coating on here, they are actually made to put together dry. So I'm gonna go ahead and set this head on here and be right back. I've got the other head resting in place, and I just wanted to point out before I stick this one on, make sure that you have your alignment pins in place on both sides. There should be 2 on the bottom corners. Make sure those are there on both sides. You kind of will know, because if your head gasket isn't sitting in place, you probably don't have one of these in place, but just double check that before you proceed on. This is where it starts to get exciting for me, because the motor is almost complete and closing in on the final steps. And now it's time for the head bolts. Remember guys, these are torque to yield head bolts, one-time use. I mean, if you had to reuse these, okay, but I really highly suggest you get new ones, just because a kit of these is only like about 50 bucks, and considering the rest of the cost of the build, that is very little. This is from Texas Speed. It's one of their kits. There's a part number on that if you guys are interested in it. There are 2 different sizes of head bolts, depending on if you have an early or late LS motor. Just be aware of that. because there's a couple of different options. This is an early one, so that's what I'm using. Get all these head bolts in place, and I will start torquing them down. Before I torque these, I'm just going to go into the head bolt difference just because I'm going to cover it. So there are 15 head bolts per head, and you have 3 different sizes. You have the small ones on top here by the intake. That's self-explanatory. They are small compared to the other 2. And then you have the 2 different lengths of big ones. You have 4 total long, and then you have the rest of the short ones. And the long ones go pretty much everywhere except for the corners of the cylinders. So up here on number 1 in the corner, and back here on number 7 in the corner, that is where these short ones go on early LS's. So if you guys forgot about that, that's where those go, 2 per side. Okay, guys. Now it's time to pay attention because this is where it gets kind of complicated. So I'm going to try and go over this with you, make it as easy as possible. The torque sequence on this is a little bit complicated, and there are 2 torque sequences depending on if it's an early or later LS motor. LS1, LS6s have the first sequence. If it's a later LS2, LS3, it is the second sequence. It depends on these corner bolts. If you have the short ones, it's the early. If you have the longer ones, it's the later. I'm only going to do the later on this one because that's what my motor is, and I am going to go over that now. So the torque sequence is as follows. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And then you have these top bolts that you do those 5 last. But now this sequence on these lower 10 bolts is a little bit complicated because the longer bolts get a different torque than the shorter bolts. So you're going to start by torquing everything in sequence to 22 foot-pounds, okay? That's the first pass. The second pass, you're going to come by and torque everything in sequence on these lower bolts to 90 degrees. And then you're going to come back and do the final sequence where the longer bolts are 90 degrees for a second time, and then these outer shorter bolts are 50 degrees, and then come back and do these 5 at just 22 foot-pounds. So again, first pass on everything minus the top small bolts. So first pass on the lower 10 big bolts, 22 foot-pounds. Come back on a second pass, 90 degrees on everything, and then the third pass, all the long bolts, 90 degrees, short bolts, get 50 degrees, and then do your final torque at 22 foot-pounds on those 5 8mm bolts, and your head's done. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now on mine. I'm gonna try and do it without screwing up, and please be sure before you torque this down that you double check. Make sure you're done internally, because once you torque these babies, that's it. You got to pull them out. They're garbage. So you're going to have to do new head gaskets and bolts, and that'll set you back about 110 bucks. And, you know, I wouldn't want to screw up. I have to do it again. So just try and double check everything before you throw this on and get them torqued down. And I'm going to try and not fuck up either. So here we go. Okay. Now I'm worn out. That is a lot of pressure torquing those heads down. And I didn't even spill my Coke, so there's a bonus. But yeah, so a lot of pressure torquing them down. My torque wrench goes up to 150 foot-pounds, so it can definitely handle it. About the max torque that was reached on this reading by my torque wrench was about 100 foot-pounds. So these would actually be pretty easy to do without a torque wrench if you got a good idea by feel where 22 foot-pounds is, just because most of your torques are 90 degrees, and of course 50 degrees being slightly over a 45. So, I mean, I definitely would recommend having one of these, but you could probably get by without it. For those of you guys though that are gonna be doing a lot of this type of stuff, I just gotta say, I highly recommend this tech wrench from Snap-on. No, I'm not sponsored by it, but it's just an awesome wrench. This thing's so easy to use, does everything from inch-pounds, foot-pounds, newton-meters. It does torque angles, and you can even do presets on this. So if I were doing a lot of these motors, I could preset all my torques in here and it would just go through, don't have to remember it, and it would just do sequence by sequence. But one thing I like about this wrench, I'm gonna show you guys, and maybe there's some other ones out there that do this as well, but you don't even have to look at the reading if you don't want to, because the way it lights up and it beeps. So of course it just shut off on me. Okay, so back on, and say this is already torqued, but say I was going to torque it. It pulls up your reading, but see how it also lights up as well. So really you can do it quickly just by sound and also visual cue, because you can see it and see once you hit green, you're done and stop. And this also will go over to red if you over torque. I'm not going to show you guys that, but if you go too much, it'll actually light up red saying you've gone too far. But super easy to use, and it's a great tool. You know, normally I don't say go buy high-end tools. I think I paid somewhere between $400 or $500 for that when I bought it. Granted, I do this stuff every day, but if you're gonna do this type of stuff as a hobby and you're gonna do a decent amount of it, I really would recommend one of those. Having proper torque is critical in a lot of things, and that is super accurate and super awesome and easy to use. So, hey Snap-on, why don't you guys sponsor me, huh? Fucking assholes. Anyway, next step is going to be, enough of my rambling, gonna get the push rods in and gonna get the trunnions in and get the rockers on here as well. The push rod length, and I'm going to double check those just to be sure, but I did order the 7.740, I believe that's the right number. That's what I ordered. That's kind of the standard length for these motors when doing factory thickness head gasket with no deck milling and no head milling. So hopefully I ordered the right push rods to give me the right length so we don't have any accidents. Getting my push rods installed, and I gotta apologize for earlier I said the wrong push rod length. I know I did not say this. It is actually 7.400 inches. So that is the push rod length. Again, 7.400 inches, and these are chromoly push rods. Again, they are from Texas Speed. And the part number for those of you guys who are interested in that. And now back to stuffing my juicy rods into the holes. Yummy. Push rods, trunnions, and rocker arms are all in place. Not going to show it on the video, but before I button this up, I may come back and do a rocker arm upgrade on this. They're usually about $300 or so. I have not decided. I may or may not do that, but for the moment, it's assembled. And now what to do with all this oil? Well, you just got to juice it up. I like to use all my leftover assembly oil, and I just like to juice up the entire valve train of the motor, especially where this might be sitting for a couple weeks before startup. Any little extra help I like to do. Really, you can't over lube a motor, I don't think. You could definitely under lube and put one together too dry, but over lubing, don't think it's a problem. Gonna get to the valve covers next, but first I put the spark plugs in. Those get torqued to 15 foot-pounds, and I like to use NGK plugs. This is the iridium number I went with. Don't necessarily have to use iridium, but I really recommend NGK plugs. I've never had one let me down. The AC Delco, also a good choice in these motors. I lean towards NGK though. Again, been using them in everything from these motors to dirt bikes, and in 20 plus years, never had one let me down where others have. So I really like to stick with the brand of NGK. And then also now is a good time to get your intake and exhaust ports taped up, just so you don't have to worry about getting any contamination in there while you're finishing putting it together. And for me, where this is going to sit, Actually going to be going off to SEMA tomorrow night. So this is gonna be the last time I'm gonna be doing this for 3-4 days. So while I'm gone and until I get back, tape is gonna protect this baby from any type of dirt or dust intrusion. So get that taped up, and then gonna come back and get these valve covers put on, get the intake put on, you know, start dressing this motor out, get it put back together. Probably gonna put the headers on, maybe just see how they look, you know, but start putting this back together in its final stages. So again, next step is gonna be putting the valve cover gaskets on this, which is just an O-ring seal on pretty much any type of LS motor. These early LS1s take a specific gasket that's different on the 97 and 98s because they use the perimeter bolt pattern versus the 4 center bolts. I personally like the later style with the 4 center bolts, but this is what I'm stuck with. So gonna put those on and get those torqued down. Okay, back to it. So what I've got done here is got the NOx sensors in, NOx sensor harness on, the steam vent piping in place, and the valve covers on with new gaskets. So NOx sensors, torque to 15 foot-pounds, obviously put the harness on, clip it in, and put your seals in place. The steam vent here, new gaskets as well there, and these get torqued to 106 inch-pounds on all 4 corners. And then valve covers on with new gaskets, and these also get torqued to 106 inch-pounds. Torque sequence on this, I just like to work from center and work out, and I'm pretty sure that's what GM factory manual says as well. So next step is going to be getting intake manifold in place. Before I get that intake manifold in place, you guys always want to remember to put your camshaft position sensor back in, because you cannot put that in with the intake manifold on there. Oil pressure sensor you can get on there without, but don't forget that cam sensor before you put that on. Bolt on it, 106 inch-pounds. Okay, camshaft sensor is in and intake is on and torqued down with new gaskets. There is a sequence on these. Start from the center, work out, and there's 2 passes that you make on this. 44 inch-pounds in the first pass and 89 inch-pounds on the second pass. Gets that baby torqued down. So that just about concludes engine assembly. I mean, obviously there's a few sensors, accessories, throttle body, and then got to do my EGR delete plate right there. But that about does it for the engine assembly. So we got a few more parts on the motor, got it attached to the engine hoist, getting ready to put it back on the cradle or K-member, whichever you want to call it. And you know, obviously besides the accessory I put on here, got the headers loosely bolted up and you know, the rest of the stuff. Point out that did do the motor mount upgrade. Got some poly mounts there. Mounts get bolted on the motor, 37 foot-pounds. Also have the clutch back in here too. It's always handy to have an alignment tool. I just happen to have some of those from work, so I was able to find one to fit, throw that old clutch back in. Bell housing bolts, 37 foot-pounds on those as well. If I remember right, the clutch pressure plate was 52-ish foot-pounds. Don't quote me on that though. Other than that, that's about it. Just barely have enough room to fit my engine hoist through right here and still get above the brake lines and the spindles on here, but there is room to make it fit. I'm gonna point this out that I did in my other LS1 removal video and reinstallation. On the power steering rack on the driver's side, normally the bolts are like this that go down. I like to take this side on the driver's side, flip it, and so the bolt goes up. Why is because if you ever have to remove this power steering rack, it's kind of a pain to get that bolt out. You have to basically take the alternator off the motor here, jack the motor up, and if you do this flip, if you ever have to remove the rack in the future, it makes it so much easier. So I like to flip that bolt just to kind of future-proof everything here. So point that out as well. You guys can do that or not, you know, doesn't really matter. Now I'm gonna get this lowered onto the K-member and get it bolted up. And then obviously I'm gonna have to support back on the oil pan because I don't have the transmission on yet, so it doesn't fall off my jack stands. I still have not decided on what to do with that thing yet. I might just clean it up and put it back on, but I'd really like to get that 4th gear synchro fix in that. Other than that, the transmission shift's awesome. It's just sometimes I got a little bit of a zip grind when I go into 4th, so it does need a new synchro. The damn thing, I don't know. I'll probably just put it back in. I'd like to fix it, but I just don't have the money right now to tear it apart and rebuild it. This baby right here has sucked up all my funds for the last 3.5 months, and I mean everything. So I don't know what I'll do. Probably throw that back in. Sorry for rambling. I'm just kind of sharing my thoughts as I go here. So get that baby lowered down onto the cradle, bolt it back up. Okay, got the engine hoist removed, bolts in place, and got those torqued down. I like to do those engine mount bolts between 47 and 50 foot-pounds. With these poly mounts, kind of a bitch to get everything lined up. You kind of have to pry and push, force a little bit, but eventually those babies do go in there. Next step is going to be getting the AC compressor bracket on with the AC compressor and getting the alternator bracket on and get the alternator put back on. Still need to clean up my throttle body, get it put back on, coil packs on, and get the wire harness thrown on top of the motor, a few little minor odds and ends, and this should be ready to go back up there. One thing I need to point out that I did not do a little bit earlier is push rod length and determining push rod length. That is one thing that I'll try to do in the closing of the video to kind of explain it, but it's one of those things I can do a lot better than I can explain, and that's why I skipped the step, if you guys were wondering that. So I'll try to get to that in a minute. But other than that, this thing is pretty much ready to lower the body back down on it and get everything reassembled, reattached, reconnected, and running. Okay guys, I got editing the video and I realized I need to make a couple of corrections. Normally I don't worry about corrections, but these were pretty big mistakes on my part, so I want to correct them. When it comes to the head bolts on this, I mentioned there is 10 larger bolts, and you have all the 5 bottom ones are the same size, but the top 5, the ones in the corners, are different size depending on if you have an early or late LS. And those corner bolts are definitely the short ones on the early LS. I had said this motor is a late LS. I made a mistake on that. I don't know why I said that. This is an early, very early LS, so it has the short corner bolts. As far as torque specs, they were correct, but just to clear that up when I said that, and that is the main thing that I wanted to point out. Okay, the other thing I want to point out on this is I said I was going to go into detail about how to measure and deal with the push rod length because you have to have a set push rod length depending on what you've done in the motor. I feel like I cannot convey my thoughts into words on that well enough to do a good video on it at this time. Maybe I'll come back and address that. But for this time, I think you guys are better off just doing a search on that or find a YouTube video that someone else describes how to do this. I will say that like on this motor, where nothing really has changed. I did not have the heads milled, deck heights the same. I'm using GM lifters. It ended up using the factory length push rod. And the best way to measure that obviously is with a cam on the base circle. But this motor ended up with the right clearances with the stock push rods. If you end up going different heads, different thicknesses, if you end up milling your heads, then that that distance may change a little bit, and it might not be enough to worry about, or it might be enough to worry about going with a different length push rod. So sorry about that, guys. Maybe I'll try and do a video in the future on that, on how to measure for push rod length, but I feel like I'm probably not the best person to explain that right now. So anyway, I just want to get those two things out of the way that I noticed when editing this video. So there you have it. There is another video. So thanks again, everybody, for putting up with another one of my short rants. And thanks again for watching another one of my long ass videos. Sorry, I just like to be really thorough as how to explain how I do stuff. And I know I don't need to throw the torque specs in there, but I just do, you know, just because it's there in my video for posterity, as always. So, motor, transmission, car. They'll soon be back together, very soon, hopefully. And then hopefully I can get back to the 72C10 or something that maybe you guys will like a lot better, because from the viewership I can tell this is kind of boring stuff to a lot of you, but you know, I just record what I do in my shop. Sorry, it is what it is. So thanks again for watching, everybody. I appreciate it, and we'll see you guys next time. Till then, goodbye.